I'm Jeff Huber. I'm SVP of Engineering here at Google, responsible for our ads and apps products. And on behalf of Women at Google, the group, and the Talks at Google series, please join me in welcoming Padmasree Warrior, the CTO of Cisco. She'll be speaking on a look at the future, which includes her perspective on market and technology transitions that are changing the nature of work, how we connect, the future of computing, including lots of video and collaboration, and I bet some thoughts on smart cities as well. Prior to her role at Cisco, Padmasree was the CTO of Motorola. She joined Motorola in 1984, rose through the ranks there to be responsible to be their CTO, and she directed Motorola Labs and led a team of 26,000 engineers. She's very actively involved in the community as well, is on the board of the Joffrey Ballet, and being a Chicago native myself, one of my favorite museums, the Museum of Science and Industry. In 2004, she received the National Medal of Technology, and in 2007 was inducted into the Women in Information Technology International's Hall of Fame. And just last night was recognized by the Forum for Women Entrepreneurs and Executives with their Annual Achievement Award, which is a great accomplishment. And given this is a bit of a geeky audience, Padmasree also recently surpassed 1 million Twitter followers, and as you'll see, is far more interesting than Ashton Kutcher or Oprah Winfrey. With that, Padmasree Warrior.
Thanks, Jeff. That's quite a generous introduction. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today. I know some of the folks at Google have been working very hard for over a year to get me here, so I appreciate very much your patience. It's actually a great opportunity to share my perspective on future and kind of treat this more as a dialogue, because I think, as we all know, any vision we have for the future, as time passes, becomes very trite and mundane, and that is really the power of technology. And innovation really is the magic that makes imagination become a reality. So my goal is not so much just to see beyond the future, but it's actually to enable it through technology. And that's why I enjoy my role so much as the CTO. So with that, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how certain technology frameworks are really going to change how and where work gets done in the future, and also reflect a little bit on what connected life might look like, and how Cisco and other companies in the technology industry are working hard to make all of this a reality, and talk a little bit about the future of computing as a platform to do many of these things. And then I want to share some views about what all this means for business, for leadership. And in that context, I'll talk specifically about women leaders, because that's a topic near and dear to my heart. And lastly, about education. How might education look like in the future? And hopefully have lots of time for questions from the audience in the room and those that are watching online. So, if you think about future, one of the things that we see happening is more and more there is a demand for tools and applications at platforms that enable intercompany collaboration. So a few years ago, for those of us that have been in the industry for a long time, a lot of companies and corporations focused on enabling cross-functional teams and engineers to work more closely with designers and marketeers. And really, it was all about how do you get diverse groups within a company to work together. And the manufacturing industry probably pioneered a transition where they started to look beyond their own walls and started thinking about how do you extend business processes to include suppliers, and not just suppliers from the point of purchase one step out, but multiple steps out. And realize that there's a huge amount of productivity gains that they could get from this. And many other verticals are now following suit. So what does this mean? This means now we have to think through developing enterprise applications that not just connect within the enterprise intranetwork, but also go into the cloud and deploy certain applications from the cloud. Which brings very interesting challenges for all of us in the industry to do that with security and interoperability, because each enterprise today uses different platforms to provide the connectivity. At the same time, increasingly, companies are depending on clusters of experts to get together and work on critical projects. And this is a very interesting idea also at Cisco. Cisco is a company with about 65,000 or so employees, over $30 billion in revenues. We do business in almost every country on the planet. And it's a country that's stitched together with over 130 acquisitions over its history of 25 years. And we just recently did an analysis. We have close to 250 CEOs in the company. They all came from some form of an acquisition or another. So the challenge we have is how do you enable these experts, these entrepreneurs to create and innovate and tap into expertise that's outside of this, the walls of the company, right? And so the power of being able to do that is experts choose the projects that they want to work on rather than being assigned by their boss to go work on a project. And so this is a dynamic process, and it's self-forming and improves agility and, in fact, produces better results. So at Cisco, the way we drive innovation and we pursue at any time between 30 to 50 market adjacencies, as we call it, are really a portfolio of growth opportunities. And part of my responsibility as the CTO is to make sure these portfolio of growth opportunities get the oxygen they need to foster the innovation within the company, as well as tap into ideas outside. Right? So we have a program that we call iPrize and iZone, where we collect ideas from various parts of the globe and incorporate that into our own innovation portfolio. So this notion is very interesting because that sort of suggests that perhaps organizations will not be organized functionally or in a structured fashion in the future. We have to think through how do we make these more social webs almost, but in the context of work. So think of the clusters of experts concept to be at the foundation of that. The next major shift that will change how work is perceived is the emergence of millennials. So people born after 1975, probably some of them may be in this room today. And this generation brings with them the notion that they want to have access to work whenever they want to work, right? So I always say this, and already we do this. The concept of going to work will go away in the future. We will simply do work wherever we are. And that ties into the next trend, which is mobility. Already there's a huge demand for an expectation that we will have access to every enterprise application on any form of device, whether we are mobile, fixed, or nomadic. And the access is really not pertinent. And so how do we solve that problem? So what all of this means to the future of work is there's a huge demand for us to create a platform that now can integrate voice, video, and data and provide those capabilities and applications in a secure, interoperable way, both from on-premise access as well as in the cloud access, which is big set of challenges, but lots of room for innovation for all of us to drive this. The second area I want to talk about is connected life. And again, here mobility is a huge factor. I used to work for a mobile company before I came to Cisco. And I often used to tell people every second on planet Earth, there are 4 babies born. Every second on planet Earth, there are 32 mobile phones sold. And so the impact of what mobile communications is going to do to how people get connected and communicate is just, we probably haven't even scratched the surface yet. And I actually believe that the term mobile internet will be redundant in the future, just like we don't say mobile email, we just say email, and we expect to get it wherever we are. Internet access will be very pervasive and hopefully seamless between whether we are mobile or whether we have a fixed access. The second interesting thing in the connected life area, and Cisco is driving a lot of this, is video. Video, we believe, will be a killer app in the future. Everything from user-generated video content. We acquired recently a company called Pure Digital, which makes the Flip video cam, high-density video camcorder, if you have one. It's now become my favorite toy. And we're trying to figure out how do we bring that capability into the enterprise space, all the way to high-density, high-resolution, multi-point telepresence. And then it's with the availability of on-demand content, now consumers' expectation is shifted. The debate is not really about content ownership anymore. How do we consume content more in a community and make that a more community experience? So we recently launched an initiative to wire up sports stadiums, Dallas Cowboys Stadium and a couple of other stadiums. And people often wonder, what is Cisco doing wiring stadiums up? And the intent is not just to provide an immersive video experience in the stadium, but we are working on how do you extend that into the home. So from your home, you can have an immersive experience as if you're in the stadium watching your favorite sport. So there is a lot we can do to sort of make content consumption much more interactive and much more of a social experience in the future. The other change that's driving connected life, I would say, is more recent. Probably this shift we've seen in the last 6 months or so. And it's probably one of the good things that's come out of the economic crisis the world's going through and has gone through. And this is the fact that there's now a lot of stimulus money from many different governments around the world to think about how technology can be applied to traditional verticals like healthcare, like transportation, like energy. So a lot of recent movement in smart grid, for example, smart connected cities, smart buildings. How do you make buildings much more energy efficient? And what role does IP networking play to make that happen? Same thing in healthcare. We have telepresence capability. How do you extend that to promote and make remote healthcare available, where a doctor can interface with a patient when proximity is not needed to provide healthcare to remote locations where maybe there is no physical medical facility available, but we can provide that through telepresence. So lots of things going on in, I would say, what I call lifestyle optimization, applying technology and what we traditionally thought of IT mostly as a B2B, but in different verticals going into healthcare, sports, education, et cetera. Lastly, computing, and probably this is something you all know more than I do. Some of us have been in this industry long enough to see the evolution from the 60s from mainframes to mini computers to PCs, more recently the web. And we believe the next evolution will be to cloud computing. But we have to help enterprises make the transition because they already have a lot of investments that they've made in data centers. And how do you help take advantage of that investments companies have made with virtualization so that you can scale cloud computing to become more of a marketplace with workload portability, federation, and security as to move data between the cloud and a private data center, for instance. So that, we believe, is three big shifts that we will see: future of work, future of connected life, and computing. And then you can think and say, okay, what does all this mean to the internet? Where will we go with it as a platform for the next 10 to 15 years? And first I want to look backwards and say, what did the internet really allow us to do, or what did we really focus on as an industry in the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, right? The network really focused on providing data transport. It was really about moving small bits of data from point A to point B. And email was probably the killer app in the first phase of the internet. And it was really a messaging platform. We all used it mostly for asynchronous messaging using email initially. And the entire industry back then was focused on optimizing price-performance ratio. So MIPS and megabits were the two metrics we all focused on: fastest network and most bandwidth that you can push traffic through. And really didn't worry about things like power consumption, cooling water requirements, data center footprint. Those things were all afterthoughts. We didn't worry about those things. And essentially, applications were vertically integrated with infrastructure. So if you had to deploy a new application in enterprise, you had to deploy new infrastructure with it. So what we believe will happen in the second phase of the internet, or as I call it, the next internet, is experiences now have to scale almost exponentially as billions more devices and billions more people connect to the network, which means now we have to think about the network being more than about data transport. It has to enable media experience, right? We've already seen this happen to the music industry. Not too long ago, several of us used to buy pieces of furniture to store physical forms of music. And now I have this little thing that looks like a dresser. It's camouflaged like a dresser, and if you open it, there's drawers to store CDs in. It's become an antique now. I don't know what to do with it. So the how we consume music is dramatically changed by the internet, and I think the same thing will happen with video next. And collaboration, I already talked about. Now, the challenge we have is how do you develop an enterprise-class collaboration platform and bring things that are now in the consumer web with, we just talked about Twitter, and Jeff mentioned I have over 1 million followers on Twitter. I love Twitter. I think it's just a great application. It allows me to have conversations that I normally wouldn't have in my normal course of the day, and allows me to actually meet many new people on Twitter. And so how do you make those concepts come into the enterprise and make them more robust to drive productivity in the enterprise? So that's really what I mean by collaboration platform, to engage in real-time interactive communications and create content and create intellectual property together, both by participation from outside the corporation's boundaries and inside the talent that's inside a corporation. Lastly, sustainability, and kind of here think about two areas. One is how do we apply internet principles and IP networking to improve buildings' energy efficiency, cities' energy efficiency, et cetera. The other area is how do you actually develop IT itself to be more energy efficient? How do we build routing, switching, data center products to be much more energy efficient? So we're focused on both their areas. And lastly, virtualization and cloud computing, how does that change compute, right? But a prerequisite for all this is broadband penetration. And I think that's where we are lagging behind in several parts of the world, including the United States. And data says that actually 10% increase in broadband penetration in developing markets drives GDP up by 1.4%. So I think the challenge we all have in the industry to drive that forward and make sure there is broadband available so that we can deploy a lot of these technologies and make the planet more smarter and greener. So at Cisco, we are focused in 4 areas to drive our technology strategy very broadly. The first area is video. Second is collaboration. Third is smart connected communities, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we mean by that, virtualization and cloud computing. So if you look at all these, of course, naturally, a lot of these opportunities drive network traffic, they drive bandwidth, and they drive innovation on the network, and that's our agenda. And so really, we expect that annual IP traffic will reach 2/3 of a zettabyte or 667 exabytes by the end of this year. So if you think about it, by 2013, so about 4 years from now, we will see global IP traffic an increase almost 5-fold from where we are in 2009. That's really mind-boggling if you think about it. And on the consumer internet, today, about 1/3 of the traffic is driven by internet video. So thanks to YouTube and Hulu and others. And internet video itself in 2013 will be as almost 700 times bigger than the entire US internet backbone was in the year 2000. So that was in 13 years. And so lots going on that will drive a lot of traffic onto the network. The other interesting data point is actually mobile data. By 2013, 62% of mobile data traffic will be video. So a lot of applications that we can create and think about creating that'll drive that traffic. So we love video, all forms of video in any form, and we are making big investments. You probably saw today Cisco announced our intention to acquire Tandberg, which makes desktop video conferencing. We already are a leader in very high-end telepresence, and I talked about Flip. So we are looking at video as an end-to-end architecture, everything from user-generated video to high-density, high-resolution video. Smart connected communities, I want to talk about a little bit. This is, really, I believe that we will evolve to what I call the industrialization of the internet. And so here the challenge really is how do you connect the cyber world with the physical world? And, so it's using sensor networks perhaps, and not just actually connecting people to people, but people to things and things to things. And this has been talked about for a number of years. We've always talked about it, the Internet of Things. But what is really driving an acceleration these days in this area is the rapid urbanization of the planet. 50% of the world's population by the end of 2009 will live in cities. And these cities add roughly 180,000 people every day. That's like creating 2 new Tokyos every year. And we expect that by the year 2050, they will be 100 new cities with over 1 million people each. And in one sense, it's good because a lot of the consumption happens in these cities. But at the same time, cities consume roughly 75% of the energy today, and they produce 80% of the emissions. So the challenge we have is how do we enable these cities to be smarter? And we are launching pilots in South Korea in cities like Incheon and Songdo, where we are helping them build smart cities where the network actually becomes a platform for enabling urban services. So where you can get information about traffic on your mobile device. We are enabling buses to have information about traffic congestion and how do you route traffic and doing things like that. We're also working on making buildings smarter by connecting HVAC systems with IP networks so that you can bring those things onto the same platform. We acquired a company called Richard Zeta that has middleware capabilities that allows us to do that, and we're bringing more intelligence from the switching and routing into connecting the HVAC onto a single platform that can be managed through software. Smart grid is another area that's very interesting, and we think that there will be 82% increase roughly in the energy demands globally by the year 2020, so in the next 20 years or so roughly. And DOE, U.S. Department of Energy, estimates that just modernization of the U.S. grids alone will help us save roughly $50 to $100 billion over the next 20 years or so. So smart grids, if deployed properly, has the capability to reduce peak loads by almost 15% annually. And so if you translate that, what that means is in the US alone, over the next 20 years, if we deployed smart grids, we would be able to save the need or eliminate the need really for almost 100 large coal-fired power plants. So that's tremendous. That's almost like taking 30 million automobiles off the road. So again, smart grid is another area where we can think about, essentially our focus is how do you enable intelligent communication between power generation, transmission stations, and home, connecting back into smart metering at home or commercial buildings. So lots of exciting things. And fundamentally, I believe that if you look forward 10 years or so, 6 of the major sectors will look very different from how we have been in the past. That's healthcare, transportation, energy, public services, perhaps IT or communications itself and how technology gets deployed, et cetera. So there's a lot of change going on, which then brings us to the question of how will business look like in the future? And here I'm speculating, so I'm really open to a dialogue with you. I think really successful businesses in the future have to be able to operate on multiple dimensions. And I think many of us actually faced this challenge recently. We have to innovate, and we have to focus on operational excellence. In the past, it was okay to do one or the other. I mean, there were companies that prided themselves on being very innovative, and there were companies that prided themselves on being operationally really good, and they could get the maximum operating margins out just by squeezing costs and so forth. And more, we are finding you have to do both. And that, I think, brings an interesting challenge for all of us. And the other interesting thing is we have to have global scale because it is a connected world, and economies are connected, as we found out recently as well. But you have to have agility at the same time along with the global scale. And how do we do that? And the other thing that's interesting, I just read recently a report that said high school students, or actually even middle school students, so kids between the ages of 13 to, I think, 19, there was a survey that was done, and almost 75% of them said that they do not want to work for a big company. So you can kind of think of this environment in the future where there'll probably be all these little startups or small companies, right? And so what is the notion of a big company anymore, and how will that change? What does that mean to business? Which brings me to how will leadership change in the future? And I spoke last night about, in the context of women's leadership, and maybe this is more of my perspective as a women leader, but I think it applies broadly to leaders as well. Traditionally, leadership was about commanding and making decisions. I had a team of 26,000 engineers in my previous job, and it was great power. If I said do this, and I could feel like everybody would do it. But I think more and more leadership is about influence. It's how do you get companies to change a direction, or the industry to change a direction, or a government to change a direction. And that means leaders have to now figure out how do you expand your sphere of influence. It's not just what you control, but it's how do you influence outside the boundaries. And this is where a lot of the social networking tools help us. I think Twitter, I spoke last night about how it helps me expand my sphere of influence. This is a skill leaders didn't have to worry about a few years ago. I mean, in fact, leaders prided themselves about being very private. We were told you can't say some things in public. Don't say that. PR always told us, don't do that. Don't say this. And so now we have to figure out, well, say it, but how do you say it? What do you say and what not to say? And the fact that you belong to multiple communities is a strength, and that's another area where you can expand your sphere of influence, right? For example, I belong to a community of engineers. I belong to a community of Silicon Valley leaders. I belong to a community of women. I belong to a community of working mothers. I went to Cornell, so I belong to a Cornell alumni community. There's various communities we belong to, and more challenge for all of us as we become leaders is how do you leverage these communities, and in what way is it appropriate to bring some of these communities to overlap in what you're doing? So those are some new leadership skills that we would have to learn. The second skill is about collaboration. And this is interesting because I actually think of collaboration as being very different from teamwork or consensus-driven committees, as we used to call them, right? It's not, collaboration doesn't necessarily mean teamwork and everybody gets along and does things. It actually means you're okay in sharing an idea before it's fully formulated. You have an idea and you want to share that so other people can add, other experts could add to that idea to make it stronger. And how do we do that? What's the right way to do it, and what's the most appropriate to do it quickly, right? So that you're not forever gathering input. At some point, you have to move on. So collaboration, how to collaborate, what it means, I think, is another leadership skill that we would have to garner. And the third is really being more than just being a pioneer or a trailblazer. And again, this is in the context of women that I talked about last night at this forum for women entrepreneurs and executives. When I started in the industry almost 20 years ago, there were very few women in engineering especially and in leadership positions. So they were women that were considered to be trailblazers and pioneers who sort of formed the way, and we were told we had to be different. Women were told they had to dress different, act different, speak different, maybe more like a man, dress like a man. I think more and more what people really appreciate is authenticity. Leadership is all about being real, who you are. And so I encourage all the women to really be women and be successful by the fact that you are a woman leader and you're a woman engineer or a technical or marketing expert or whatever it is. So I think this notion of trying to be different or being a pioneer by being different is going to change in the future. So I think those are some things that I think about how leaders of the future, some of the challenges that they will have to deal with. Which brings me next to education, and this might be controversial. But I actually think there's a big difference between education and learning. And if you think about it, right, the famous Einstein quote about, I forget the exact quote, but it's something like, it's a miracle that curiosity survives formal education. And in a way, it's so true, because now content is available. And so the fact that education is really about teaching content has to change. It has to become more about how do you teach how to learn. Because students these days can access content in anywhere. So what do you do with that content? How do you actually make, if you think, my view is education is more discrete. It has a beginning and an end in some ways, whereas learning is continuous. So we have to teach our children how to learn continuously, and what do you do with all this information that's available, and how do you create something with it? So I think education perhaps will also take on a new meaning in the future and become more about learning, I hope, anyway. So I'll stop there and take questions from all of you, if you have any. I think that's my last slide. And I think there's microphone on one side.
I'll start. And go to the microphone so that people can hear me. You mentioned the really needing to drive innovation and operational excellence, which has been not historically viewed as necessarily complementary. Agree that is the necessity and reality of today. How do you think about that with your teams and as a leader at Cisco, applying that across Cisco?
That's a great question. It's a very tough thing because, right, I think innovators pride themselves as not being process-driven. They don't want to follow process. Process is evil. And people that are good at process think of innovators as being these crazy people that just keep coming up with ideas and they don't know what to do with them. And I said as a company, we were pursuing 30 adjacencies, which is a lot for a big company. And each of those we expect to be $1 billion opportunity almost. So that's where we expect our next $30 billion of growth to come from. And we think we have to go to 50. And so one of the challenges is, okay, what do you do? How do you know which ones of these are right? And how do you know which ones you want to accelerate and double down on and which ones you want to slow down? So I actually came up with this methodology with some of my peers at Cisco. We've taken Jeffrey Moore's chasm model, if you're familiar with that, which talks about technology adoption life cycle, and there's a chasm, and there's pre-chasm, post-chasm. And we've actually taken that, and most of the growth opportunities, if you think about it, fall in the pre-chasm mode. When you're an innovator, you're thinking about something that's still early. You probably don't know if there's going to be a market yet. So how you measure that is going to be very different from something that's more of a mature business. And we have come up with ways by allowing different types to measure progress on something that's innovative, but there is still measurement, and you still have to, I tell people this, you don't graduate with your PhD just because you're brilliant. You still have to defend your thesis. There's a process and there's a gate you have to go through. Similarly, if you're asking for funding within a company or from an outside company, you still have to hit some metrics. And so we're trying to put those metrics in the discipline, but at the same time allowing people the freedom to create and come up with great ideas.
Thank you, Ida.
Hi, congratulations on your award last night. I was lucky among a few of us to hear you, and it was really just a fantastic speech. And, sometimes you hear these speeches that galvanize you, and that was one, so thank you. I'm curious about your Twitter experience, if I can do that in a career-limiting way. We struggle all the time with quality at the scale that the internet, the information that's managed out it's impossible to manage at our scales, but at the personal scale, when you have 1 million followers, how do you crowdsource in meaningful ways? You mentioned that you got a lot of value from that. How do you manage that, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the beginning, I was, so when I first started, I was one of the early adopters of Twitter. I think when I started, there were very few people on Twitter. And at the time, I felt like I could say anything I wanted to because nobody was really reading it. And then all of a sudden, you find out that everybody's reading it, right? I recognize that Wall Street Journal is following me and everybody else is following me. So now, then you realize, oops, maybe I have to be more careful what I say. But actually, what I found to be most useful for me is when I am thinking about a concept, for example, collaboration. I was preparing to give a keynote at one of the large conferences, and I was thinking about the future of collaboration. What does it mean to the enterprise? And I said, okay, let me use a collaboration platform to ask that question. So I asked people, what are your 5 predictions for the future of collaboration? I got a ton of input from people everywhere. People in the industry, out of the industry, analysts, just people that are users of the technology. And I gathered all that input, and I think this is a room for an app on somebody has to create for Twitter. If somehow you could get, today it's manual, I gathered all the information, and I had one of our smart engineers at Cisco develop a piece of software for me where it's tracked and it creates, for me, what are the words that are appearing most frequently. So things like mobile, things like making it more productive and robust, those types of things came up in this prediction, which in turn influenced my view and therefore our strategy for Cisco. So I think to me that those kinds of users are the biggest benefit I get. I also write haiku on Twitter that has nothing to do with my work, just because I like writing haiku. And now I have all these people that love poetry following me on Twitter. I think it's just the fact that it's so easy and simple, and you have to keep it to 140 characters in a way forces you to be really crisp about your point. And the input you get is also likewise pretty crisp. So in a way, I use it both to relax, share my personal thoughts, as well as share things that relate to work. I've, in a way, become a channel for Cisco's marketing. Now I get tweets from our Cisco marketing people saying, hey, can you please tweet this? And I send back saying, isn't this your job? So it's actually become more fun now.
Hi, thanks for coming. I read a few years ago that John Chambers was saying that e-learning is going to make email a rounding error in traffic. And you talked about education and how that's going to change. How do you see the role of technology companies in driving that change in education? And how do you see that happening?
In education?
In education, yeah. Especially higher education, like 4 years for a degree, like PhDs. How do you see that changing?
Yeah, I think there is a lot, and I think this is just emerging. One of the things we are doing, I guess there's several things we are doing. One of the things we are doing more to actually just increase the level of education in primary schools and schools in general in developing countries is deploying things like telepresence to promote teachers to access students remotely and get access to education, right? Because I think the advantage with something like telepresence is that it's a very immersive experience. You see the person as if they're life size and they're just right there. So we're doing that type of thing. We also have things like networking academies where Cisco actually deploys these academies worldwide. And I forget the number of people that go through this. It's a very high number. It's something like 300, 400,000 people that have graduated through these networking academies, where we train people to actually manage the network, operate the network, about networking, actually. So we do specific domain expertise. Now we are thinking about, okay, we have that infrastructure. We've trained people on networking. What else could we use it for? So recently with the Obama administration, we used our networking academy infrastructure in Michigan to help retrain the workforce to do additional things. So we're doing that type of thing, which is more, I guess you can say it's vocational education. But in higher education, how that will get transformed, we have to think through, just like we're thinking about virtual healthcare, how do you get this content? I think one of the challenges we all have in the industry, there is a lot of information now. I think we've all made that happen. And now the challenge is how do you provide relevance to that information? How do you connect people, community, and information, and with this triangle, how do you provide relevance to that? And so that's one of the things we are working on in research-wise. And I think if we do that, then we can think about education being very different, where I was talking earlier about perhaps you can tell the students there's relevance to these sorts of information and they can go access that. And then the education is really about what do you do with that piece of information.
Hi, I'm a product manager in one of the research teams here, and one of the things I think about a lot is productizing research. So I'm curious to hear your views on what are some effective ways to accelerate that research to product. Specifically because Cisco in general, I see as a company that does R&D by acquisition for the most part. And from your experience in Motorola, I'm curious to hear what you think works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at very different models. When I was at Motorola, we had a research lab with close to 800 people that were doing essentially, I would say, pretty fundamental research, working with universities, and then we had a very disciplined way of transferring that into commercialization. Cisco, you're right, we have a very small focus on research. Mostly we fund universities to do the research. And the philosophy at Cisco is that we let the people that are really good at doing research do the research, and we will either acquire or focus more on developing. But we do tap into, Cisco uses what I call, I was talking about this earlier, this notion of iPrize and iZone very effectively, where we post a problem and let innovators bid on it, and we have a competition, and whoever wins, and the competition, it's judged by independent judges, not just Cisco teams. We have VCs and people from academia participate in that, and winning idea gets $250,000 seed funding from Cisco, and we usually negotiate something for the intellectual property and so forth. So we do it that way at Cisco. But I think to answer your question about some of the things from overall my experience about research, it's very important to do research because that's how you discover things, which is mostly in the invention phase. The challenge is how do you translate those inventions to innovations, right? And this is where you have to tie very closely with what is the market transition going to be. I think it's very critical. One of the big challenges in bringing things to market is actually catching the transition at the right time. Timing is very important because you can be too early in the market and have a failed product, or you can be too late. and at which point you won't make very good margins. And so you have to get the timing right. And the biggest challenge that I felt when I was leading research organizations is getting the timing right on when you take something out of research and move it more into product development, and how does that handoff happen. And so to do that, really, you need to have input from multiple directions, right? You have to have a feel for what are the global trends in the market dynamics. And sometimes it's hard to predict. Like I was talking about, the Internet of Things has been in research phase almost for 10, 15 years. People have been working on sensor networks. But it's only recently we've seen commercial need for it, mainly driven by smart grid. And the smart grid demand happened because energy has become a problem. Now there's stimulus money going into it. So other factors change that. So somehow you have to have a feel and your finger on the pulse of the changes that are going on in the marketplace. And whether you do that in the research organization or you work with other parts of Google that does that, I think that's very critical.
Hey, so you've worked at two very interesting and hallmark technology companies with Motorola and Cisco. Just curious, your observations on the relative places, sort of cultural differences, the corresponding management and leadership challenges that those present, and then also, you've made the transition from the Midwest to Silicon Valley. Any observations on life and business differences between the two?
Great. I tell people I'm very lucky. I live in Chicago and Palo Alto, two of the best places in the world to be. Very different companies, Motorola and Cisco in some ways, but very similar in other ways. I think the similarities are that both are very global, with large footprints across the globe. And I consider myself a global citizen. I love being part of a global company. So those are the common things. Both very heavily engineering driven, and I'm an engineer, so I love that. I think that the main difference is that I think Motorola is probably more of a consumer company, mainly because of the handset business. And Cisco is much more of an enterprise-driven company, although we have, big push into consumer in other areas, which means the how you sell and how you go to market are very different in both companies. Cisco has a very superb sales process. I would say one of the best I have seen in any company. Our sales teams are amazingly good. And it's great to have them backing you when you're meeting with customers. And this is something I love doing, the customer-facing interaction, which Motorola didn't have so much because we sold mostly to carriers. And it's not so much direct sell into consumers or into customers. So different from that perspective. Also, Cisco is a much newer company. Motorola is almost 80 years old now, I think, and Cisco is about 25 years old. Actually, this year is, I think, our 25th anniversary. So I think that in itself brings very different nuances. And as we were talking about earlier, Cisco is a company that's made up of acquisitions. So there's a very heavy entrepreneur spirit in the company just because it's a collection of little companies in a way. But the culture at Cisco is very family focused. We sort of, John Chambers always talks about this and he calls it the Cisco family. And when he was interviewing me to come to Cisco, and we talked almost for a year before I finally said yes. I think Randy shared this story last night at the FWE story at the event. But when you say Cisco is a family, it kind of sounds corny a little bit. But in a way, it's true. I think it is something. There is the notion that we compete outside the company and we work together inside the company, which is very powerful. I think this is sort of like the foundation for collaboration and the clusters of experts that I was talking about. Moving from Chicago to Palo Alto. And winter's here, which is great. I think you can't beat the weather in California. That's great. And really, I feel like this is the pulse of a lot of things that are related to technology and innovation. Just having this opportunity to talk to people like you is something that is, for some reason, not as much there in the Midwest. It's surprising. Great schools there, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Urbana-Champaign, 2 national labs, Fermi and Argonne. So a lot of tech gets created, but probably more in the invention area rather than in the innovation area. So it's in a way, that's another change. But, I've been in the semiconductor industry a long time. So I feel like I've been coming here all the time, but now I finally have moved here. So I think this has been a slow transition, maybe over a long number of years rather than an abrupt transition.
So I was going to ask a similar question as Jeff's, but maybe a follow-on, which is just around some of the personal career choices you've made, and going from a very large company to another very large company. And it's interesting parallel in the Google, right? We're not Cisco, we're not Motorola, but like we are at a very different stage of our growth, and how you've thought about your career paths and the size of company that you've decided to join.
Yeah, actually, I don't know that the size of the company is as much of a factor, because all big companies start small and they grow to be big, and it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. All small companies want to be big and all big companies want to be small. It's kind of a weird thing, but I think some things apply, whether it's a big company or a small company, right? The ability to get things done and the ability to figure out how do you go after something. I mean, those are the same, whether in a big company or a small company. So I think the career choices I have made have mostly probably had to do with looking for an exciting opportunity where you can make a difference, rather than whether it's a big company or a small company. And I think that means, and as I was talking about last night, you kind of have to step out of your comfort zone, and that's what I've done. I spoke last night. I am originally from India. I grew up in India, in a small town in the southern part of India, and decided to do engineering in the northern part of India. And I left my home when I was 16 and went to New Delhi to do engineering at IIT, which is one of the hardcore male-dominated engineering schools in India. And my first day of registration, after I registered, I discovered there are 5 women in a class of 250. And I was told this story. I called my dad the next day and said, I want to come home. And he said, it's too late. You decided to go there. Now you stay there. I thought he was like the meanest dad in the whole world back then. So I thought I was very clever and I knew how to get around this problem. So I called my mom and then and I told her how much I was missing her cooking. And now I have a teenager now, and I know if he called me and said if he was missing my cooking, I would have him home on the next flight. But my mom had more sense than that, I think. She said, you stay in school, I'll send you food. And so I ended up finishing my engineering school. And so that was the first time I moved out of my comfort zone. And then I left India to come to the US to go to graduate school. I went to Cornell, did my master's in chemical engineering. We were talking earlier about how you go from chemical engineering to being CTO of a Cisco. So I finished my degree in chemical engineering at Cornell, and I started in the semiconductor industry as an engineer, as a line engineer actually. Then worked up to become the CTO for Motorola semiconductor business. And then from there, I went to run a business which had no technology. It was all operations, managing supply chain costs and taking beatings from customers every other day because shipments didn't happen or something. And then I became CTO for Motorola. So the point is that I think as you look through your career opportunities and your growth opportunities as a leader or personal growth, I think it's to make those transitions and use those transitions as opportunities where you can derive a lot of growth. And that can happen in a small company, big company, personal life, and you go through a lot of growth when change happens in your life. So how do you take all of that, which defines you, who you are as a leader and as a person?
Question for you. Congratulations first on your award last night. I function as a project manager here at Google, and one thing that came to my mind is you were talking about how processes and innovation are not necessarily considered as going hand in hand. So how have you managed to integrate the two together, and what are the models that have worked at Cisco, especially given the next phase of internet that you're working on?
Processes, and what was the other thing?
Innovation.
Okay, great question. Yeah, I think this is something that's my job. What I'm asked to do is how do you apply process to innovation? So all the engineers sort of hate me, but I keep telling them, I think the advantage of having a process, but the process has to be flexible. I don't think you want to do process for process sake. I think you have to think about how do you use the process to help people accelerate what they're working on, right? So the way we've been able to develop that is to sort of look at the 30 or 50 adjacencies that we are pursuing, and they vary everything from putting a router in space to using video as the next big architecture, right? One is very big, one is a very niche opportunity. It's highly technically challenging to think about routers in space, and they require very different kinds of metrics. And so the process has to be such that it's really flexible to allow that diversity that innovators need and the room they need to create. And it's not about, you shouldn't measure them on did you make a mistake and how many mistakes did you make. So it's not defects that count, right? It's not the traditional quality metric, but it's what do you do when you make a mistake and how do you go to the, or when you find you have an experiment and it didn't yield the result you were expecting, that's still a result. And so you have to accept that as a success and go to the next thing. So it's actually having those types of that type of flexibility in the process, I think, is very important. Otherwise, you get very bureaucratic and bogged down, and nothing ever gets done.
So I have a question. I think earlier you mentioned that a lot of young professionals are preferring to work for a smaller company versus a bigger company. What do you think companies like Cisco or Google could do to retain and attract, talented youth to come and work for their companies? I imagine these are the type of people who have the entrepreneurship and innovation to really make any company great. And so it seems like it would be important to attract or retain them.
Yeah, and this was a report I had read that talked about how school students, when asked what they want to do, almost 80% of them or something said they don't want to work for a big company. They want to work for little companies with few people, which made me think, wow, what does that mean to companies, right? In the future, how will they operate? So that's kind of where I was quoting that data from. But I think what we can do and what we should do is sort of create that agility within a big company. I mean, the big companies, by the way, have a lot of advantages, right? And there was an article in The Economist recently that talked about how big is back. I think when times get tough, as having scale helps. I think being part of a big company is very attractive because you have cash, you have very high margins, and the business is not going to go away, and you can take the hit for a few months or a few years and come back. So there's definite advantages to scale, but we have to combine the agility and the flexibility with the scale. And I think this is a generational shift that we will see as kids that are growing up. I have a teenage son, and to him, email is dead. Dead. If I email him, I have to text him or post an update on his Facebook saying, "I've sent you an email. Please go read it." And he always asks me, "Mom, why do you leave me a voicemail on my mobile phone? I know I have a missed call, and I know you called me. I'll call you back." He never checks his voicemail, which is very frustrating to me because I grew up with email and voicemail. So I think this notion, what they require is very different, so we have to figure out what motivates them. It's the flexibility, it's the ability to do work, not necessarily to go to work, and how do you enable that to happen? I think those kinds of things, we have to give them that flexibility, yet be attached to a more stable entity, perhaps, which could be attractive.
Okay. Maybe a last question. You mentioned your interest in poetry and sharing haikus on Twitter. Springing this on you a bit, any chance you have one you'd like to share?
I'll probably write one tonight.
Okay, write one tonight and dedicate it to women at Google.
All right, I will do that.
So thank you very much, Padmasree.
Thank you.